Everyone's on mute. Jenny, it's just you and I.
Oh.
Andres, we're so excited you're here. Sorry you had to wait so long. We're going to get going shortly. So welcome everyone. We're just going to give it 30 seconds or so before we kick off, as our colleagues are still joining, hanging out in the lobby. Hi Keegan, you muted, so. Joe, yay. Keegan, I think you're going to do this next time. I'm booking you. Oh. David, please remove Read AI. Okay. Jenny, how do you feel? Should we kick off?
Good. Yeah. How many people have we got? I can't see.
We've got 28 so far, so that's a really nice audience.
Lovely.
We certainly don't want to keep Andreas Strauss waiting any longer. So welcome everyone. My name is Colleen. I head up OD at Omnicor, and we're so thrilled to host Jenny Greenblatt. Jenny is an expert in strategic innovation and creative problem solving, and she's worked as a strategy consultant for many years, focusing on improving organizational and individual performance. And she realized early on that there really just wasn't a good, systematic approach to creative problem solving. And that's where she came up with her methodology, which then influenced her doctorate. And most recently, we've been working with Jenny. Jenny's been very patient with the leadership at Omnicor as we try to get our heads around the new methodology and a new understanding and approach to creative problem solving. And you can also check out our recent podcast where Jenny took us through some more interesting ideas and, just busting all those myths that we sometimes hold. So for the session today, the structure will be that Jenny will speak for about 40 minutes, take questions at the end. You're welcome to pop them in the chat. We are recording, just for your FYI, so that we can give this to colleagues afterwards should they not have been able to make it. And we're looking forward to a great session. Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. I am delighted to be here with you today, sharing some of my perspectives on creativity and innovation. So I'm going to be sharing some quite high-level principles with you to start off with, and then I'm going to be discussing how they can be applied in practice. I'm going to be touching on that quite briefly. And yes, as Colleen mentioned, if you don't mind keeping questions for the end, that'd be great, because what often happens is that questions that emerge are then subsequently addressed in the discussion. So I'd be more than happy to discuss your questions at the end. Thank you. So I think it's well accepted that creativity and innovation are not just nice to haves in business these days, but that they really are essential if we want to establish and maintain a competitive edge. So we need to be able to innovate not just as and when the mood strikes us, such as in that mythical eureka moment in the bath, but we need to be able to innovate on demand. And this is a big ask. How do we innovate our products and services or create new structures and processes in our organization that enable us to produce our products and services in new ways, deliver them and sell them, etc. So it is a big ask. But I'm going to put it to you in this webinar that a structured approach to creative problem solving can enable this. So the title of my talk is Finding the Gems, because it really is through creative problem solving that we can find those hidden, most valuable gems, those concepts of innovation that would invariably won't just land in our laps, but that we actively have to hunt for and unearth, so that the approach is how do we look for these sparkly things like a magpie. So that's why the title of the talk is Finding the Gems. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be just first of all discussing some high-level principles with you. And these are three key ways that I believe we can spark innovation. I'm going to be discussing challenges and how I believe the challenges are really the treasury or the storehouse of creativity. I'm going to be discussing structure and how, contrary to popular belief, I believe that structure is our friend in creative problem solving, as it really does provide a map of the terrain so that we can navigate some fuzzy problems that we have to deal with. And then thirdly, I'm going to discuss how to activate curiosity to help us to search for these hidden gems. So first of all, I'm going to be discussing challenges, which are really, as I've mentioned, the treasury of creativity. When I was at school, I read a book called Illusions by Richard Bach, and there was an inscrutable line in there. So it was very counterintuitive. So it really stuck in my head, and the line was this: "There's no such thing as a problem without a gift for you in its hands. You seek problems because you need their gifts." Now, when I was at school, this made absolutely no sense to me. Why would we actively seek out problems? And it's only now, many years later, that the meaning of this has become clear. Because when we name and frame a situation or a particular aspect of that situation as a problem, then we give ourselves the opportunity to shape it into something that's not just okay, but something extraordinary. So we could encounter a situation in which things are just ticking over, they're functional but suboptimal, and we'll leave those to tick over unless we actually name and frame that as a problem. So that's why now I believe that the greater the problem, the greater the potential gift that of innovation that we can glean from that. So if challenges are rich treasure chests of opportunities, it's important to actually identify that there should then be a variety of innovations that have emerged from challenges in society, in the economy, in the environment, etc. And I would like to invite you to identify a couple of innovations that you can think of that have emerged from challenges that people have encountered. And I'd like to invite you to pop a couple of those comments in the chat. And while you do that, I'm going to highlight a couple of examples that have come to mind for me, some pretty obvious examples. COVID, okay, a seriously big challenge that was a global challenge that spawned a number of innovations. You know, of course, we've got the solar solutions and alternative energy solutions, But there were other players as well, such as Zoom, who really benefited from this challenge, invested in their business, and apparently increased their revenue by 300% year on year by the year ended January 21. So that really was a boon for them. They were able to take advantage of that crisis. Netflix, in the first half of 2020, added 26 million subscribers. So that really was a pretty impressive example of people being able to turn challenges to their advantage. Then there is the spindle, is which is benefited from load shedding in that it's a energy efficient alternative to a tumble dryer. So it takes out most of the moisture from clothes, and that is done very well under load shedding. And then there's the Wonder Bag, the Wonder Bag. Now, I received a Wonder Bag for my birthday last year, and after opening it and being a little discombobulated to start off with because the styling isn't really me, I have found it absolutely invaluable in keeping food warm. And obviously it takes no energy at all. So there's a bit of a plug for Wonder Bag. And this webinar is not being sponsored by Wonder Bag. And then there was a guy in Springs who was sick of cleaning his pool, a guy called Ferdinand Chauvier, and he came up with the idea of the creepy crawly, the indispensable creepy crawly. And then there were a couple of guys in Paris who were looking for a taxi on a snowy night. It was a cold, snowy night in Paris. They couldn't find a taxi, and they used this experience to come up with Uber. So a variety of lovely innovations, or just when the product or service was established, being able to take advantage of a crisis in order to innovate and develop that product or service offering. Colleen, are you able to share any comments that have come up in the
Sure.
chat?
Susan was saying delivery companies, electric cars,
Yeah,
for one.
yeah.
And I just added this whole fact that we're here having this webinar, remote working, and that shift has been massive.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, absolutely. So nice that we can see then that our challenges are really storehouses of opportunities. So if that's the case, what stops us from treasuring our challenges as springboards to innovation? Why do we typically run away from problems? Well, I suppose there are a number of more subtle explanations for this, but I think it's the most obvious is basically fear. We are scared of problems. We feel very uncomfortable with problems. So that's why you'll often hear the cry, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. But I think that's such a pity because we really are missing out on an opportunity. And then secondly, and possibly less obviously, we're also scared of innovation. So why are we scared of innovation? And I would suggest that first of all, innovation is by its very nature high risk. Of course, we can waste money. We can waste time pursuing an idea that really doesn't work. And very importantly, we can end up looking really stupid if we come up with an idea that we think may work, but everybody just laughs out the building. So it is high risk because by definition, we're trying something that hasn't been done before. But another reason that I think we're also scared of innovation is that we don't know how. How do we start? How do we think differently about a problem? Do we just get people in a room and ask them to brainstorm? Once they've come up with some ideas, once they've brainstormed, what are the next steps? How do we get people involved? How do we maintain momentum? Do we just get people in a room with a bunch of bouncy balls and sticky notes and crayons? And will that maintain their momentum? And then when we've got some reasonable ideas on the table, how do we see it through? How do we turn the seeds of ideas that have emerged into meaningful innovations? So I think that that's a key reason why people are scared of innovation. And I would suggest that there are two key approaches to navigating the fear, and I'm going to be discussing both of these. The first is by adopting a structured approach, which gives you that map of the terrain. And the second is curiosity. And I've heard it said that when we approach a scary situation, we can't be simultaneously scared and curious. So it's something that I've adopted, is that I try to approach scary situations that I encounter with more curiosity. But more about that later. We're first of all going to discuss a little bit about structure and why I believe, as I mentioned, that this is an ally in creativity. So when we have a structured approach to a problem, as is represented by this path up the mountain, we are told where to start. We have got an idea of next steps, and there are parameters, there are borders on the path. So by implication, structure implies constraints. If you didn't adopt a structured path up this mountain, you would just start at any point and ramble up in whatever way you saw fit. So there are many who do argue that structure or constraints, because the two really work hand in hand, are the enemies of creativity. And there are many who argue that we need to feel completely free, we need to feel unbounded, we need to have that childlike sense of play in order for our creativity to flourish. And I think there's a reasonable argument that can be put across to defend that position, but research does suggest otherwise. Research does show that constraints, and especially the voluntary adoption of constraints, actually supports creativity. And when I say research shows, then I'm referring to a number of studies. So it's not just one study, but a number of studies that have explored this question from different perspectives. So, for example, if there are constraints to resources, that can often be useful. If you have an abundance of resources, an overabundance of resources, often that deadens creativity because people feel too comfortable. So you need a bit of an edge in order to push you to be more creative. And of course, I think a great example that proves the point is if anybody's old enough to have watched MacGyver, then you would know that a limited set of resources can be a great spur to creativity. So I know there's been a remake of the series of MacGyver, but in the olden days, when I grew up, there was a series of MacGyver starring Richard Dean Anderson, and he would be stuck having to ford a raging river, and the only resources that he had to hand were like a piece of sticky tape and a matchstick, and he managed to do it. And in fact, I've subsequently found out that there's a term now that it's been used as a verb to MacGyver something, is to use limited resources to solve a problem in creative ways. So sometimes limits to resources can actually be very useful in creativity. Another study has also found that adopting a more standardized or routine approach to creative problem solving is also more useful than a laissez-faire approach. It's also the solutions that are generated under those conditions are also more creative. And one of the reasons that's been proposed to explain those findings is that perhaps it frees up cognitive resources to be creative. So we're not just thinking, what are the next steps? What can we do next? But we're able to use our cognitive resources to for the purposes of creativity as such as well. So those were quite interesting. So the question then is, does structure, is it something that's going to trip us up? Or is it something that's going to provide a clear path that helps you to reach the mountain peak? And clearly, based on the argument I've just given you now, I believe the latter. Structure has got a number of benefits. And firstly, and I think most importantly, it guides us to think differently. It makes us dig deeper for the gems rather than collecting the stones on the surface, because your first ideas are really going to be the most creative. So often we've got to explore a problem from different perspectives. We've got to turn it around and look at the different facets, and we've got to dig deep in order to come up with creative ideas. So our enemy here really is default thinking, and structure can guide us to look at a problem in different ways. So as a simple example, let's just say that we've got a problem in our organization. A key incumbent has resigned, and let's say that's the marketing director. And so our default approach would be to plug that hole. We want to hire somebody to fill that role. And so we can go to a recruitment agency. And of course, this approach can plug the hole, it can work. But there could be another way. If we unpack the problem in more detail, if we dig deeper, we could think, what are the roles and responsibilities of the current incumbent? And perhaps one of the things that they do is they write proposals to new clients. And you might then think, well, perhaps our department heads could be in a better position to write those proposals because they're closer to the product or the service, and so they may be better placed to write those proposals. So we can still then hire a new marketing director, but perhaps we want to shape the role and that set of roles and responsibilities for the new incumbent to better suit our purposes. So it's a simple example, but the point I think is important, that we need to look at things from different perspectives, and we need to take the opportunity to create a new reality, because that's really what creative problem solving is. It's about looking for the gems in the situation, those sparks of innovation, those seeds of creative ideas, and creating a new reality on that basis. So it's not just about plugging the holes and returning to the status quo. So a structure provides a detailed path that enables us to travel further into unknown terrain. So that's a little bit about structure. And now I'd like to touch on curiosity. And I'd like to suggest that curiosity, especially if we're looking at it as an aid for creative problem solving, should not just be a vaguely passive state of mind where we say, I'm vaguely interested in this problem, and if something new comes to me, I'll be receptive. I suggest that it's actually an active search, what should be an active search for new ideas and perspectives. And that involves asking a bunch of questions, which brings me to the question, is there really no such thing as a bad question? And I'm not going to put that to you right now, but think about it. And I know that the prevailing idea is that there are no bad questions. And perhaps that's true, but I would suggest that there are more or less useful questions. And that's especially true if we're looking at the fact that the aim of questions is to broaden and deepen our understanding of a problem. So if that being the case, we need to pursue different lines of questioning. It's not just good enough to try and find out what is the root cause of this problem. And typically that seems to be the way that people like to unpack a problem. People like to look for a root cause, and once they've got that, then they can home in on that. But it's really important to pursue different lines of questioning if we want to broaden and deepen our understanding of the problem. And I must say that in my experience, people find it hard to pursue different lines of questioning about a problem. Typically, they'll want to pursue one line and follow that. Ideally, one question will spark another, but then it's often hard for people to say, okay, we've pursued that, now let's generate another line of questioning. So that's why I do strongly suggest using a framework of questions that enables both a comprehensive coverage of issues, as well as an expanded understanding and a deeper understanding. So I think having a framework of questions and prompts that take us in different directions is very useful. I'll touch on that more a little later. But in addition to having this framework of questions, I think it's also really important and really fundamental that we start with humility. Um, Humility is a fundamental attitude and position if we want to be open to new opportunities, because sometimes we think that asking questions can be, or sometimes the way that questioning is used is to uncover gaps, um, and in the process, catch people out, make ourselves sound cleverer. But clearly, the reason that we want to ask questions is to invite in new perspectives. So it's important to start with that attitude of humility where we are open to new ideas and we appreciate that we actually don't understand the problem fully. Then it's also really important to ask purposeful questions with the aim of unpacking the problem. And I would suggest here that it's the process of questioning that actually sparks curiosity. So it's something I'm going to expand on a little bit later as well. But curiosity is sparked not just through having this open attitude, but it's about the activities that we engage in that spark our curiosity. So a series of questions will make you more interested in something that maybe you weren't that interested in before. And that then has the result of building a complex, fluid mental model of the problem. So we understand the problem to have a lot of moving parts. It becomes a whole lot more interesting. And that really creates the essential groundwork, a fertile ground from which creative ideas can be generated. It's very important, I think, at this stage to add a note of caution. Curiosity and humility are not comfortable, because activating them actively implies putting yourself in a state of not knowing. And we don't like to not know, it makes us feel uncomfortable. Curiosity involves actively welcoming uncertainty. And that is also going to be an uncomfortable position to be in. We really don't feel pleasant with uncertainty. Often people will actually prefer to know that there's an unpleasant consequence that's coming along rather than being uncertain of knowing what the consequences are going to be. Simplification is much easier. We typically like to say, this problem has got 3 key components. I understand the root cause, and then there are these 2 key symptoms, and these are the things that we're going to tackle. And maybe, yes, that's the result that you're going to get to at the end. But to start off with, it's a great pity if we oversimplify before we've unpacked the problem, because we're going to miss out on the intricacies, on the light and the shade and the nuance and the texture. So it's a great pity if we oversimplify too quickly. So creativity involves allowing ourselves to be, or in fact, actively making ourselves unsettled such that we create a new reality. Because typically, if we are very comfortable in our current circumstances, we're not going to create the new reality. So now that I've discussed a little bit about challenges and why I believe that this is really the treasury of creativity, this is where the gems are to be found. I've touched on the structure, which is our friend in creativity because it provides a map of the terrain, enables us to think differently about the problem, and why activating curiosity helps us in our search for solutions. Now that I've touched on these, I'd like to discuss how do we harness the sparks of innovation that emerge from these 3 dimensions. And before I get into the methodology that I'm going to be chatting about, just a bit of background. I've worked as a business consultant for most of my career, and invariably, I would find that my clients have always said that innovation is important to them, but I've never actually found a client that has helped their employees work through innovation creativity, come up with creative solutions to a particular situation by using any practical guidelines. So at best, they would get people in a room and say, okay, let's brainstorm. And it's not really helpful, because really what you're saying is, look, innovation is really important to us, and we want you to come up with creative ideas. And the issue is, where do we start? So often they'll use aphorisms like, we must embrace failure, and we must think outside the box. And that's great, but where's the box? What's the box? Where do we start? How, where, what is the process? What does it look like? So that then motivated the approach that I took in my doctoral research, which was to develop a methodology for creative problem solving and a structured approach. And I have called this the Magpie method, and I've subsequently called it this. I have not called it this in my thesis because it would certainly be thrown out, because it doesn't sound nearly academic enough. But the reason that I've called it this is because it's about looking for the gems in a situation to enable innovation. So it's a structured approach to finding the gems that enables creativity on demand. I'm going to talk you through just a couple of high-level principles that inform this approach before I give you an overview of the approach, and then take you through a practical example of how to apply certain aspects. So first of all, it's an action-driven approach. I believe in the principle, I believe strongly in the principle of behavioral activation. So the idea here is that your state is driven by your behavior. So you don't just wait until the mood comes upon you before you take certain actions. So if, for example, I want to become a more generous person, it's far easier for me to grit my teeth and make that donation and then wait for the accompanying feelings of generosity to follow than it is for me to just sit and think, I need to feel more generous, I need to feel more generous. It's actually a harder route. It might sound like a simpler route, but it's actually a harder route. So I believe in behavioral activation. So this approach is very much action driven. So you take the actions first, and then the creative state follows. So creative state and mindset follow creative actions. Then curiosity, as we've discussed, and similarly, curiosity is sparked by modeling behaviors as opposed to just saying, how could I be more curious about this? Okay. And then tenacity. To find the most valuable ideas, we must dig deep. So there's a lovely quote by that Newton apparently said when he was asked about how he came up with ideas of gravity, he said, by thinking about it for a long time. And I love that, because that's how we come up with our best ideas. We've really got to dig deep. So the key elements of this method, I'm going to take you through just first of all the high level elements, and then just touch on the detail. So in creative problem solving, there are three key phases. Constructing the problem, so this is first of all identifying the problem, and then working with it to reshape it, make it malleable, make it appropriate for ideation. And then the next stage is ideation. This is where we think of potential ideas or solutions to a problem, and then it's about taking action, choosing which idea we're going to work on, and implementing it. Now, these are universally accepted, but invariably ignored. So universally accepted, basically all versions of creative problem solving will include these elements, these three stages. Sometimes they'll be slightly differently worded or repackaged. You'll have one stage divided into two, but really in all forms of creative problem solving, including something like design thinking, you'll find those three phases. So really there's no point in reinventing the wheel here. But it's important to mention that these stages are invariably ignored. And what do I mean when I say this? It is that typically people will jump into solutions. So that's where you'll get, let's brainstorm for ideas. Typically, people won't want to get into constructing the problem because there's an assumption of, we know what the problem is. And problem construction has actually been found to be the most important stage in influencing the creativity of solutions that are subsequently generated. So it's a great pity to miss out on that stage. And then taking action, very often there is not the kind of rigorous attention to detail that's warranted, and that people don't really identify and evaluate what are the potential, is there potential value in an idea that doesn't seem great at first? How could we develop this? How can we prototype it before we launch into full production? So often that stage is also ignored. But they are fundamental stages in the creative problem solving process. But that's the high level. And then there's the detail. The detail. The detail is when the magic lies. So I've spent in the development of this methodology a fair amount of attention in mapping out the detail of these stages, of how they should be conducted, and establishing practical guidelines as to how to conduct each of these stages. Because it's really important that these detailed steps are followed in order to sidestep the lure of traditional default thinking. Because this is the enemy of creativity, is default thinking. And it is a trap, because it's convenient and it's comfortable, and we've been down that road before, and we know that if we follow this, this approach, there's a logical, obvious solution that's just waiting for us. And why should we take the time and the trouble of coming up with a new idea? So our default thinking is really the trap that we need to avoid. And it's through following the detail in these structured steps that helps us to sidestep that trap. So now that I've discussed the approach in giving you an outline of the methodology, I'd like to take you through a practical example of how, not the whole methodology, but elements of this methodology can be applied. I'm going to take you through the process of solving a problem using curiosity and structure, and not using curiosity and structure. So really what this methodology does is it employs these factors of curiosity and structure, and it encapsulates them in the detail of the steps. And when I do this, with the poem by Robert Frost, this lovely poem about two paths in a forest, comes to mind, and the last stanza is, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference, and I just love that. And so the question is, how do we establish this new path? How do we forge a new path that which others haven't followed before? So that's what we're going to go through, and that's what we're going to try and get to with this approach of using structure and curiosity. But let's try first. Let's just let's play with this, with a problem, not using structure and curiosity. So let's say that our problem is, or our challenge is, we want to make money out of an influx of tourists. So we know that there are going to be a bunch of tourists coming to town for some reason, and we're short of cash, and we're thinking, how can we make money out of that? So variety of different ways, and we think, okay, quite a simple approach. We are going to rent out a couple of mattresses in our lounge, and should work. We'll advertise this, and should make a bit of extra cash. So that solution works. But is it the most creative solution? So let's now adopt a different approach. Let's say what happens in our second approach, what happens if we use structure and curiosity and we follow some elements at least of this magpie method in order to harness the virtues of structure and curiosity. So this is our challenge. Now, the first stage, once we've identified the problem, when we're working with problem construction, is this holistic problem mapping. And I've adopted a very simplified approach here because the approach that I do use is pretty detailed. I'm not going to take you through it here. But this involves using a structured set of prompts to expand our view of the problem, to unpack the problem. So let's look at this example. Our problem is that we want to make money from the influx of tourists. So we start to think, who are the stakeholders in this problem? Let's say that they are just the tourists and the property owners. What do they want? They want a solution that's affordable. They want affordable accommodation. They want to know, so this is the tourists, of course. The tourists want to know that, that the accommodation will be of a reasonable quality. And some of them want to live like a local as well, because being a tourist is not so cool. And then they're the property owners. They want to make money from their asset, but they also want confidence that the tourists are trustworthy. So what are the obstacles that we can think of that might prevent these needs from being met? Well, in terms of affordability, if we've got a limited supply, because we've got this influx of tourists, this is going to increase hotel prices. The assurance of quality, independent property owners could actually be scam artists. If you want to live like a local, well, if you're going to rent a room in a hotel, there's no living room, no kitchen, so you're not going to feel like a local because you're going to have to go to restaurants. And property owners who want to make money from their asset don't know how to market it. And their confidence that tourists are trustworthy may be important to them, but tourists may not pay or they may crash the place. So that's a concern. What could some enablers be? How could we overcome some of these obstacles in meeting stakeholder needs? Well, if there's limited supply amongst hotels, property owners have got extra space. Independents could be scam artists. Well, we know that these days consumers are more and more informed by social media reviews before they make a purchase. No living room or kitchen in hotels? Well, you could rent a whole apartment. They don't know how to market. You could get a third party to market. Tourists may not pay or trash the place. Perhaps we could get a third party to share the risks. So now we've got an expanded view of our problem. What are we going to do with that? We want to try out different ways to frame the problem because the question that we ask is going to inform the range of solutions that we can generate as a result. So we want to play with some of the concepts that we've generated when we've mapped out the problem in a lot more detail. And so let's just say we pick a couple of these concepts and see what happens if we combine them together. So we use a mix and match approach to problem framing. We think, how could we ask this question of, we want to make money from an influx of tourists, how could we ask that a little bit differently? Well, we could combine this issue of assurance of quality, social media reviews, and getting third parties to market. And let's say that we then combine those together into getting a new problem frame. So our new problem frame is how to use social media to bring property owners and tourists together, enabling mutual trust. So now we've got a differently framed problem. We're seeing it through a different pair of lenses. Once we've got this problem frame, we can draw on a variety of different ideation tools. And really, brainstorming is not the most effective ideation tool. There are a wide range of others. I'm just mentioning a couple in the slide, and I'm going to go through a really simple, fun one, which is wishing. Now, just before I do that, I want to just mention that the most effective ideation tools actually use prompts because, again, it's about channeling your thinking in different directions. So it's not just about saying, what ideas can you think about? But it's saying, if you look at it this way and that way, how can you funnel your thinking into different directions? So that's what the effective ideation techniques do. So wishing is quite simple and it's fun. Um, Imagine you had a fairy godmother who could make any crazy wish come true. Jot down about 20 ways that you wish you could solve the problem, even though they may not be realistic. For example, let's say I could get all tourists together with property owners in one big room so that they could check each other out and show each other their credentials and testimonials. So that's my wish. I could then read through these wishes and see which ones I could then shape into something that could actually be practically implemented. So in the first stage, I'm dispensing with any constraints of practicality. I'm saying, let's assume everything's practical. So that frees you to think of a variety of different solutions. And then you say, okay, which could I actually turn into something feasible? For example, I could build an online site where the tourists and property owners could meet each other virtually and share online reviews. Maybe there's something to work with here, because now when we look at our problem, if our problem is how to make money out of an influx of tourists, now if we've applied structure and curiosity, we come up with an idea that spawned Airbnb. And while I don't know if this is actually the process that they followed, this is actually, it very closely mirrors at least the story of how Airbnb was founded. Is that initially there were these two guys, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia, if I remember correctly, who had an apartment in San Francisco, and there were some tourists coming in who were going to attend a design convention, and they actually wanted to put down air mattresses in their loft apartment and give people breakfast, and that was their initial solution. And from there they developed it. So that was, kind of that was the lowest common denominator. That was their default approach, because again, that just kind of plugged the hole. But then they developed it into something a whole lot more interesting. So that is an example of how you would work through this structured approach to creative problem solving, engaging your curiosity and unpacking it and unpacking the problem in more detail. So that brings me to the conclusion of the webinar, at least my presentation, but of course I'm happy to engage with your questions. And I'd like to just come back to, in my final thoughts that I'd like to share with you, I'd like to come back to this quote by Richard Bach: "There's no such thing as a problem without a gift for you in its hands." And perhaps typically we would like to have our problems given to us, or not our problems, our gifts given to us in a neat little box that's prettily presented, where we can just lift the lid and we see the gem nestling in tissue paper. But invariably, in real life, it doesn't actually happen that way. Invariably, we are given rough diamonds, and sometimes they are very rough diamonds. And I think we need to develop those skills of polishing and honing the rough diamonds to reveal the gems underneath. And I would argue that that is a really life-enriching skill to develop. So I'd like to open up for any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. That was amazing. The whole idea that, what was my favorite quote, was the fact that there's a rich treasure chest of opportunity when we see problems, and that's a great reframe. I'm just looking at my to-do list and trying to do that. Anyone have some questions, David? I think you're going to, are we going to unmute, or you can pop them in the chat?
I think we can put them in the chat, and then we can unmute them after that.
Okay. So we're busy working through this process with Jenny as our leadership at Omnicor, and it really is daunting to go through the questioning. And I have a whole newfound respect for the power of asking the right question and multiple questions and deeper. So we've got a nice comment there from High Praise. Amazing presentation. Thank you. So that's great feedback. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
I'm going to pick on someone, maybe Keegan. Keegan or Matt. Matt's also been working through the process, so it'll be really helpful to hear your thoughts of the session today. Can you unmute people, David?
I can. Let me just give a second here.
Our praise is saying, I'll definitely use this process moving forward and share with my team.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Anyone got any questions for Jenny before we wrap up? Maybe things that you'd like to clarify? Susan saying, thank you so much for the practical insights. I'll certainly try it and share with my colleagues. Keegan can't think of a questions in a different way of thinking. Oh, so you're in awe of a different way of thinking. Will take a lot of time for me to reshape the way I think of problems. And then Oretillo, loved when you spoke about how constraints support creativity, sometimes to think about and apply. Yeah, because it's very counterintuitive.
Yes.
That story narrative we've been shared with is this whole idea that it's just artistic people who can do this, and your classic fidget spinner and Play-Doh and glitter, although those are fun.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
They don't have to look like that.
Absolutely. And there's certainly a place for that.
And Matt saying he enjoys the amount of detail your structure goes into, and the pathing processes helps to identify what to ask next. And it really is a very thorough process, which I highly recommend you try out in a facilitated fashion. I think it's tricky to learn and apply in your area, because maybe also we're just so stuck in our own default thinking, as you spoke about, Jenny.
Yeah.
It's been helpful for you to challenge us a bit, and I think it's left our team arriving to a very different problem than the one we started in our series of workshops with you. Ah, Hilton's here. Hi, Hilton.
It's got to unmute. Oh, yes. Yeah.
Hi, Hilton.
Hi, Hilton.
Hi.
Thanks for joining. We know you were busy. We're just in the questions and answers. Maybe you want to share just your takeaways from working with Jenny up until now.
I mean, I've just joined. You want to put me on the spot?
Sure. Okay, Joe. Joe has said that I agree with and appreciate the concept that creativity is supported by a structured process, opens it up to all and not just the supposedly creative people. Deepa, yay, Deepa. Hi, Deepa. Enjoyed the presentation and will certainly try the structured approach next. Lovely to have you in the audience, Deepa.
Great. Yeah, just to comment on Joanne's comment that it allows just us normal people to be creative, and that we don't just have to leave it to the so-called creatives, because if we just depend on, if we just use that idea that there's certain people who are creative and then there's certain people who, who are less creative, obviously that's disempowering. But I think it's also disempowering to say, you are naturally creative. Come on, use your creativity, because then it's like, okay, great. I am creative. And I think it's great to build people's creative confidence, but the question is, what do you do with it from there? It's like, okay, I'm fired up. I am creatively confident. And now what? So that's what the structured approach is about, is that it takes you into what next? What do I do with this?
Great to hear from Neville. Wonderful to have you, Neville. Neville saying that it was an enlightening presentation, but do you distinguish between big and smaller problems / challenges?
Yeah, so I would say it's necessarily about big and small, but maybe it's about complex and simple. And I would typically use this for a more complex problem, because it is time consuming and it does involve some cognitive sweat. So it's got to be applied, I think, for problems where you think that there is that potential for creativity, and that is in complex problems. If you've got a simple problem and you're just looking and you know that you do just want to plug that hole, then you really don't have to go through this process. Otherwise, we would all be completely hamstrung and we'd never get out of bed. So I think there's a reason that we do adopt the default approach, and it's obviously very useful, but it's just when we want to be creative, when we're confronting a complex challenge, that's when to pull out all the stops and, gear yourself up.
A lovely comment from Lauren saying that the notion of approaching problems with humility and uncertainty is very empowering rather than being fearful. And I agree, Lauren. And it was just interesting to note, Jenny, that you said we're fearful of challenges and we're also fearful of innovation. So
Absolutely.
That's a double bind because
Yeah,
you're just going to stay stuck.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Neville. Neville's grateful for your reply.
Thank
Any
you.
other final comments, closing questions? Cassandra is thankful. She enjoyed the insightful presentation, and I agree. And I really appreciate, Jenny, that you went to so much effort, beautiful presentation. Things haven't been that easy for you, your side, and we really appreciate your contribution to our audience, because at the end of the day, Hilton has his hand up. At the end of the day, Omnicor presents these webinars. They are not sponsored by Creepy Crawly or the Spindling or any of those things. But David, maybe you should look into that. But we really want to add value. We want to add value to our team. We want to add value to our customers and our coaches. So it's so wonderful that you've been able to provide that for us today. Hilton, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, sorry I missed the whole thing, Jenny, but what I would say, just with working with you closely over the last few months, has been that we're going to problem solving with so many blind spots. We have so much intuition involved, and we just feel like the answers jump up at us. And creative problem solving for me is like doing a due diligence. Like if you were buying another company, you would do a deep dive into their financials and their business practices and everything. You would ask all the awkward questions. And it feels for me a bit like that you kind of go in, even the stuff that is just so obvious to you, you ask the questions around it and new answers emerge. So it's definitely, I think, a very effective process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear about, one of the things we need to do is challenge assumptions, but then how does one do that? Because your assumptions are often so deeply seated that you can't even raise them as assumptions in order to start challenging them. So that's why I do believe that the structured approach helps to identify them as assumptions and allow you the opportunity to interrogate them.
Correct, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Hilton.
Great. If you want more content, you can check out Jenny's podcast or also make contact with her on all her social media platforms. And I highly recommend that journey. We're still got to continue ours.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It was lovely to host you all.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the feedback, and I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Thanks, Colleen and Hilton.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.